Okay, I think I'm on. Hi, this is Professor TOVANCHE, and I'm going to be giving you all a sort of just brief sort of overview about myself and about my vision for the class. Sorry, this is going to be a little, it's all very impromptu. I'm just kind of recording here off the cuff. Hopefully you'll just bear with me. Now, I was gonna do a live video where you can actually see me talking and so forth, and I was just like, well, I didn't. Quite honestly, I didn't feel like shaving. The things are really, really hectic lately. I'm finishing up uh, my fall, excuse me, my spring semester here in Texas, where I teach. Um, I do teach at a community college in Texas. I teach a variety of classes. I teach U.S. government, of course. I teach history. I teach Mexican American history. I teach the U.S. history survey courses. The survey means history one, history two. In those courses, I have for a very long time incorporated a great deal of material on the African American experience. So I think that I hope that you're going to get a lot out of this. Now, this, of course, is the African American struggle for equality. Just a couple of things on terminology that you will see in the subsequent lectures and communications that I have with you. Sometimes I'll say African American, very often I'll say Black. I see these as interchangeable, although not everybody does. Um, but just so you kind of know that. Um, as far as terminology too, terminology is always very, very difficult. Do you call a person a slave or an enslaved person? Do you call a person an owner or an enslaver? These are not, these things seem to be changing. I'm well aware of them. I'm still kind of stuck in how I've always done things. So I will say slave owner, slave, black, these kinds of things. Um, we'll see how that sort of develops down the road. I don't know that it'll change, but anyway, that's that. Um, Kind of rambling a little bit. So I didn't grow up in Texas, by the way. So I live in Texas with my family. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. So I am from the north. I came straight from Cleveland in 2008, right out of law school. Came straight to Texas, came straight to the community college where I teach now. In fact, I realized in law school that I love the study of law. It's fascinating. It's one of the most challenging, it really is the most challenging intellectual thing I've ever done. But the practice of law wasn't all that enticing. I did work a little bit in the public defender's office while in law school and in the juvenile division, and I really liked it. But I really, really love teaching. So I got out of law school, had already had my master's degree in history, got out of law school, and I came to teach in Texas. Now, I could, here's the thing, why am I telling you all this? I guess a lot of you probably don't care. But I could be, in fact, practicing law. And a lot of my friends are like, why don't you practice law? And it's just like, I really enjoy teaching. I even passed the horrendous Texas bar exam, which is one of the worst ones in the country. I did that. So I am licensed to practice law, but I really, really enjoy teaching, and I enjoy teaching history because it has so much to do with what is going on in our society today. Education is really, really important to me. That's another thing. And it wasn't always that way in terms of formal education. My parents tried as much as they could to give me a culture of education, even though they didn't have one. My mom went to first grade, my dad went to fourth grade. They, for a long time, all their lives, they had factory jobs and things like that. And I went to the Cleveland Public Schools, which have never really been known as, for the decades that I've been alive, never really been known for academic accomplishments. And so I didn't really always appreciate education as much as I should have. My parents, my mom especially pushed it on me, education's important, and I owe her a great deal. My dad too. In fact, I actually dropped out of high school, worked, at a supermarket for years, and while there, I kind of dropped into college, and by that I mean that I would take a class, so one semester, and then take 2 semesters off, and take 2 classes and another semester and then take a year off. I just kind of did this for a very, very long time. And in fact, it took me, and I wasn't until I was 32 years old before I actually had my first degree. Now, I'd always loved to read, and I really mostly read nonfiction. So I really loved learning. I just didn't like the formality of everything, right? But I finally, got tuned into it and went to college, buckled down, and got my first degree at 32, my undergrad in history, and then of course have got a bunch of degrees thereafter. Um, and so I am much more appreciative of the culture of education that my parents really tried to give me, even though they didn't have it. So education is important to me for these reasons, but it's also, learning is very fascinating to me. The brain, it's this marvelous, marvelous muscle, right? I do a lot of reading today on how the brain works, biology, psychology. A lot of this has to do with the fact that my son is on the spectrum. Oh, I'm going to share a picture. My wife said it's okay. So here's a picture. Here's my mom. This is actually taken a couple of years ago, Washington, D.C. And my wife is there on the right. Her name is Tracy, and that's my boy Gordon. This was taken a couple of years ago. He's actually a lot taller than I am now. You know how it is. They hit 14 and boom, spring right up. But yeah, so that's my boy there. And in fact, he's not my biological son, but I call him my son, and he calls me Papi, right? So he is on the spectrum, and he's very high functioning, but of course he's got a lot of sorts of obstacles, and reaching him and teaching him has affected sort of my view of teaching and learning, has affected sort of my pedagogy, the way I go about teaching. And so I just thought I'd give you a little bit of an intro on that. I hope this intro is part of, how you see my approach, how I hope you can succeed, and just a little bit about me. Now, you might not care about this, and, quite frankly, I get it. Some students, myself, if I were in your shoes, would be like, let's just get on with it. I get that. But interestingly, research shows that students like to make this connection with a professor, especially in online courses. Now, when I was coming up, I took a couple of distance learning classes, and honestly, I didn't care who my instructor was. I never saw my instructor. I didn't care whether this person kept in touch with me. I didn't care if this person related to me. I didn't know about their personal lives. I didn't want to know about their personal lives. They didn't have personal lives as far as I was concerned, right? But research, and you might be like this. I was like that, but research shows that, students like to make a connection somehow. So this is a different generation of students. I don't know. I don't think there's any harm in kind of just trying to reach out. So there's a little bit of something about me. I live in Fort Worth with my family, my wife, my boy, my parents, my mom. My dad died a while ago. My mom still lives in Cleveland. I got a big family over there. I still visit, and I really can't wait to go see them shortly, once this whole COVID thing is over. So anyway, why study history? I guess I should broaden that question out a little bit and ask you, why study anything? All of your college courses, be it this course or a course in biology or a course in sociology or mathematics, all of these have one thing in common, and that, of course, is learning. But what is learning? Learning is much more really than the acquisition, the getting of knowledge. It's not just about facts. In fact, education is about learning how to think. Now, I have to be honest with you. I took this off the internet. I've seen this before. I don't know whether Albert Einstein actually said this. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters is the truth of the statement. Education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. And so that is how I see education. When we talk about education, it's not just about absorbing facts, it's about critical thinking. And of course, critical thinking is this amorphous, sort of shapeless thing, right? What does it mean? Well, it can mean, I think, a lot of things. Synthesis, putting things together that maybe don't seem like they go together, disaggregation, taking things apart, right? Analogy, learning by analogy, taking a relationship between these two things and seeing that same relationship between these other two things that don't look anything like the first two things. It's about application, right? So applying rules and knowledge. These are forms of critical thinking. They're all different ways to learn. And so, in fact, history, the study of history, is in fact a way to learn. It's not just the learning of the history that matters, but it's the learning how to learn that matters. Now, when I talk about ways of learning, we have to be careful because I'll tell you, and you may still disagree with this because I think they still teach this in high school and so forth, but there is really no such thing as learning styles. I don't buy into this idea that students are visual learners. Now, the research shows more and more that this is not true. So a lot of people who subscribed to this idea of visual learner and learning styles, they now call these learning preferences. They're trying to soften it up, right? And I get that. Now, there are, in fact, ways that some people learn facts more quickly than they learn through other ways. What do I mean by that? So some people might find it easier to see something and learn it. Others might find it easier to hear something and learn it. And when I say learn it, in this instance, I mean remember it, the knowledge. Okay? So there are different ways to receive information. But learning is much more than that. I know that certain ways of learning may be easier for some, be it audio, video, kinetic, right? The movement thing. But learning also means learning how to use these other ways. If you are if you think that you are a visual learner, doesn't mean that you can't learn in other ways. It just means it's a little bit harder for you to do that. And it really is important that you learn other ways to do that, because well, think about it this way. Think about it this way. God forbid, so to speak. If a visual learner goes blind, right, or an audio learner goes deaf, I mean, does that mean you stop learning? No. It means you find other ways to learn, which means that you could do that now. It's just harder to do. And in fact, research shows over and over again that if you engage these other forms, these other ways, these avenues of learning, you get smarter. Your brain actually reshapes itself physically. Your brain is very plastic. It's called plasticity. Now, a lot of you guys might have heard of these sorts of things. The point is that the more you learn how to learn, the smarter you get. Is it possible to raise your IQ? Assuming IQ means anything, you might disagree and say, well, IQ doesn't mean anything. Maybe. But there is such a thing as intelligence, and I think we know it when we see it, kind of thing. There is a way to raise your intelligence. If you want to use the term IQ, fine. Of course, that's a little bit loaded because it comes with a test, right? IQ is related to a test. But there is a way to improve your intellect. There is a way to be smarter than what you are. And that's by engaging stuff that is given to you. Learning, and I don't know who John Holt is and whether or not he actually said this, but again, the words ring true for me, right? Learning is not the product of teaching. Learning is the product of the activity of learning. So you have to engage it. You have to grasp it. You have to do something with the information, not just throw it back at somebody and say, well, I know this. So you can improve all of these things by engaging the materials in different ways. I'll just give you some examples. My boy has trouble with kinetics, right? Body movements. He has trouble also with audio stuff, hearing something and being able to sort of translate it into his own sort of understanding. But I still push these things. My boy didn't. He's, like I said, he's a very high functioning, very bright. He's in honors classes. He goes to a school that deal with students who learn differently. Most of his most of his deficiencies, if you want to call them that, are in fact related to social stuff and a little bit of, I think, anxiety that he doesn't really even know he has. But anyway, he's got a lot of problems with kinetics, how his body moves. He couldn't tie his shoes until age 10. You know, I met him when he was 10 years old. He's going to be 16 in what's today's date? Oh, in a couple weeks. Anyway, he didn't know how to tie his own shoes. And so what I did, of course, was just had him sit there and just do it over and over and over and over again. It was easier. It was better for me, instead of standing at the door waiting for him to tie his shoes when he's under pressure. I sat him down and said, "Hey, Kate, let's sit outside, and you just bring your shoe, and we'll sit outside, and we'll, you'll drink a fizzy drink, I'll drink a beer, we'll hang there, and I just want you to kind of play with the shoe, and and that way all the pressure was off, right?" And so he learned how to tie his shoes, right? And for a long time he said, "I can't do it," and he tried, and his mother tried, and he couldn't do it. But no, obviously he can. He couldn't ride a bike until he was age 15. And, I tried many different things with him. What finally worked was that I bought a tandem bike. So I had him on the back. So he's going through the motions of pedaling and so forth and holding onto the handlebars. And so it took a while, but he did it. And so what's my point? My point is that some things take time, right? But it doesn't mean you can't learn them. It just means sometimes it takes longer to learn them. Now, he still has problems with audio. What I wanted, I had this idea. I wanted to blindfold him and like walk him about town and ask him, "What do you hear? What do you hear? What do you smell?" Right? Because, sometimes he's very laser focused on one thing in front of him that he's watching, that he's seeing, right? And so he doesn't really pay attention to what's around him. I wanted to blindfold him and walk him through town. My wife didn't let me because he said he would look silly. He's a teenager now, so he doesn't want to look silly. So I didn't make him do that. But I think it would work. I've had my own struggle. Math was huge for me. I had a lot of trouble with math. In college, I didn't take college math because I did not want to deal with algebra. So I took logic and something called symbolic logic, which was very, very hard. But it was an algebra. I don't know that I had a mental block, something. But that's one thing that I just would not do. I couldn't do it. Or so I thought. It's interesting because that was many years ago. And a few years ago, I started teaching GED to adult learners. And one of the subjects I had to teach was algebra. And guess what? I could do it. I could do it. Something that I could not do when I was 14, 15 years old, I can do it now. Why? It's not because I really studied algebra since then, but it's because I've studied other things. I've studied logic. I've studied cause and effect. I've studied law, right? Relationships and all these things. And so my point is simply this: we all have these struggles or these obstacles that we think we can't overcome. In this country, we tend to think, well, I'm either good at math or I'm not. No. People say I'm either good at history or I'm not. No. It's just that some things come easier to others. But it doesn't mean that you can't learn, you cannot be good at these things. I'll give you an example. I actually lived in Japan for a little while. About 15 years ago or so, I moved to Japan. I actually left law school, moved to Japan, and I went to go teach English over there. And I was teaching English to middle schoolers, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. If you ever want to go to Japan, or if you have any curiosity about how I did this, feel free to ask. I went through a program called Japan Exchange and Teaching, the JET program, wonderful program. Anyway, I remember when I got there, I was being led around by the principal, or whoever it was, and I look up on the wall, and there's these fantastic images of manga. What do they call it? Manga. The Japanese, cartoon, whatever it is. I forget what they're called. Anime, I suppose. And so I look up and I see this, and I'm like, wow, this is fantastic stuff. What artist did this? I figured it was, maybe a couple artists in the area, or maybe even just a couple of students in the school. He goes, all of our students did this. And I was amazed because they were fantastic. Now, some of them were better than others, but they were all better than me. And what I learned about teaching in Japan is that the Japanese assume that all students can do all things. So over there, it's not like, are you good at music? Or are you good at math? Are you good at sports? They assume you can do them all. In fact, all students in Japan, they all tried academically, they all studied, they all played a musical instrument, they all played a sport, right? Um, and and so and they all drew, right? They all drew, so they had visual, auditory, kinetic, all these things going on. And they just assumed it would happen. We don't tend to do that so much in this country. We tend to sort of focus in on what a student is particularly good at, which has its own merits. I'm not saying we should change how we do things is just the way the Japanese do it. What I'm saying is that people have and children especially have the capacity to learn in many more ways than we give them credit for. So learning is more than facts. Okay. History is more than facts. History is not just facts and dates. In fact, I'm not going to test you on dates. There are some dates that are important. 1619 is a particular one that comes to mind right away. But I'm not going to ask you, what year did this happen? I'm almost never going to do that, right? But 1619 is an interesting date. But here's the thing. History, what is history? History is a story. It's not just facts and dates. It's somebody's story. In fact, our memory of history is a battle over that story of what happened. How we remember it, how we memorialize our past is not the same thing as history. Because history, when we think about it, is something that happened, right? But memorialization, it often twists that. And not everybody agrees. I mean, we see this today in the battles over, Confederate monuments as to what history means. How do we memorialize and why? We misremember a lot of history. Pretty sure Napoleon said this. History is a set of lies. And it's a bit cynical, but there is some truth to it, right? Because we choose the kind of history that we wish to remember as a society. We misremember a lot of it. And this is crucial because, as you probably know, it's very Orwellian, right? George Orwell, who wrote 1984, whoever controls that story, history, whoever controls the story, the memory, controls the future, controls our present, right? It controls our present understanding of who we are. And of course, many people have said this. History, of course, is written by those in power. This is a truism, but we have to be real about that. Now, we're not Orwellian in the sense that, at least not as bad as things were depicted in the book 1984. But we do have some challenges. Hopefully, we'll never be Orwellian, and I have a lot of confidence that we won't be. Historians continue to battle out what happened. Not all historians, and so they're at the forefront of this whole thing, right? So long as we continue fighting over these things, over what history means and what memory means, then we won't become Orwellian. Not all historians agree on the past. They don't agree on which historical facts matter. They don't agree on which questions matter. Should we talk about this or should we talk about that? We can disagree about that. And you might think that a fact is important when I think that maybe it's not. But that's the beauty of it. We disagree. And in fact, historians disagree about what facts and questions actually mean. What do they point to? How have past events shaped who we are? Historians will look at a primary source, and you will learn what primary sources are if you don't know already, but there's some material in your modules there. But historians will look at a primary source, at a document from the past, and very often they will read it differently. They'll say, no, I see this. And another one will say, I see that. So in a sense, history is a continuing battlefield. But again, people are intent on memorializing certain things rather than having a more nuanced, fleshed out understanding of history. So I guess we're touching now into this question of why do we study history? Studying history can help us dispel a lot of mythology, a lot of um, the misconceptions. Now, when I was growing up back in the day, you may have heard this. I don't think they teach this anymore, but I was certainly led to believe or allowed to believe George Washington never told a lie. Of course, that's not true. The story so goes that when he was so upright, he was so truthful that when he was accused of telling a lie as a boy, he was accused of telling a lie. He went outside and chopped down a cherry tree in his anger and angst. Now, that didn't happen, but I believed it. What does this mean when we put people like this on a pedestal? I mean, do you know anyone who cannot lie? I mean, we tell 1,000 small lies a day. Hey, your hair looks good, you know? Or, do you like the color or do you like my painting? Or how was my performance? Oh yeah, it looked good. It was good. We tell 1,000 lies a day. I don't know about 1,000, but you get my point. Everybody lies. So by saying, George Washington never told a lie, it sort of elevates him above humanity, which is not a good thing for history. It's not a good thing for our understanding of ourselves. So, and of course, this is not the only mythology, right? People will say, that, the Constitution gives us the right to vote. No, it really doesn't. If you read it, it does not. So that's a mythology. We think we have the right to vote, but the Constitution doesn't give it to us. How many witches were burned at the Salem witch trials? Well, none. Well, first of all, I don't believe in witches. You might, but even if you do, you would look back and say, well, suspected witches weren't burned, or witches, maybe they were killed, right? They were hanged, but they weren't burned. But we have this idea. What was the cause of the Civil War? Well, I'll tell you one thing. It was slavery, and we're going to talk more about this. So when we look back at history, we have this misconception. We think we always celebrated immigrants. No. We think terrorism is only a recent problem. No. We we think civil rights were only about Black people. No. And so by studying history, we are able to better understand each other, and we're able to see each other more clearly. Communities are able to understand each other better by studying history. And when I say communities, I'm talking about like women, immigrants, poor white men, people of color, all people who built this nation, who have made contributions, even in the face of obstacles, even as people tried to exclude women, immigrants, poor white men, people of color, they made contributions. So studying history helps us understand how these communities see each other. It also helps us put current events in context. It helps us understand why certain communities are situated where they are. Why has there never been a woman president in this country? Why had we not had a Black president until 2008? Well, I mean, think about it. If an alien came down and looked at the United States and found out we never had a woman president before, I mean, he couldn't be faulted for thinking, well, I guess women just don't have what it takes to be president. Of course, that's not true. We have to look at the history of how women were treated, much as we have to look at how other communities, and in this case, the Black community, was treated. Now, I have to be very clear. Teaching and learning about history is not about hating who we are. It's about understanding who we were and understanding how that affects how we see ourselves today, how we see not just ourselves, like I look at myself, but how I see others as well. Admittedly, it doesn't really give us, and it can't give us the answers to how we should run our society. It doesn't and can't give us the answers into how we deal with today's issues. But it gives us context. It can give us an insight into humankind into understanding others. It gives us a broader and richer understanding of our nation. It gives us insight. And that's just studying history generally. But why this course? Why African American? I'll first tell you what we're not doing here. We're not here to cast people as victims, not as mere victims. Let me put it that way. Even people who've been victimized in the past have had, of course, a sense of agency of their own, meaning they have made choices in their lives despite the obstacles that surround them. There is a context to all of this. People struggle. They don't just sit down and get beaten over and over and over again without ever standing up and demanding change. So I'm not here to cast people as mere victims. We're not here to do that. We're not here to criticize or to blame groups of people and say, you did this. We're not here to simply point to the negative side of U.S. history. Hopefully, the reasons that we are here will become clearer soon enough, particularly as we move through the course. So, but I'll tell you, it's interesting because this course has never been taught at CCV before. So why now? It seems it's been sort of on the drawing board for some time. That's my understanding. I don't really know. But if you look at contemporary events, right, things that are happening now, there's a lot of reason, I think, that we would need this course because it helps us understand contemporary events. We have continuing problems. And this course, I hope, will lend itself to a greater appreciation of history, a more nuanced understanding of history, of who we were and who we are in relation to each other today. Now, African American history courses are not new. Many colleges across the country have been teaching it for years now. And in fact, a lot of this really jumped off in recent decades. It really jumped off out in the 1960s, this rights consciousness era where in the 60s, people talked about liberty, equality, inclusion. And people who came out of these battles, black and white, who were veterans of these wars, veterans of the actual war, meaning Vietnam, but veterans of the wars here at home. These people would later on become teachers and professors, scholars, writers, leaders in their communities. And they would push for this sort of more inclusive history. And in the last 10 years, a lot of this has actually gained ground. The issue of race, especially in the last few years, is directed really to greater inclusion, greater equality, which now people are saying is equity. Equity. So equity is the newest sort of movement, and so it's not easily defined. Some people believe that equity means equality of treatment, treat everybody the same. Others say equity means equality of results, treat everybody with the understanding that everybody's different and try to get them all to the same place. Now, I think reasonable minds can disagree on what that means and whether or not it's proper. I don't really know for sure. I'm not going to get into that. But my point is simply this, is that it is public discourse. It is a thing now, so to speak. People are talking about it. Now, when it comes to studying history generally, most, though, would agree that it should include a greater understanding of how we see each other, right? A greater understanding of quote unquote minority communities and how these communities have helped shape our society, how society did not always welcome these communities, even as these communities fought for greater inclusion, be they women, poor white farmers, immigrants, so forth. But a lot of this history has been hidden. Until the 1990s or so, a lot of this history wasn't really being taught. But since the 1990s especially, we have a lot of courses on women's history and labor history and gender studies and things like that. but a lot of it was hidden, and Black history among them, right? Black history was largely hidden for a very long time. Not Black history was not considered part of the tapestry of the quote American quilt. That Black history was not seen as part of our culture and part of our identity as a nation. In fact, for a long time, Black people were not thought of as builders of this nation, as shapers of its culture. That's not true. But what, so a lot of it was hidden. But when it wasn't hidden, when Black history was often talked about, even in history courses, this history is often painted or this community is often painted as mere victims, objects, things that are done to them. These are slaves. These are not people. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. Often treated as secondary citizens, people who are just simply segregated out, as though they have no agency, no will of their own. Sometimes they're not seen as victims at all. Some people would say, well, slavery was not all that bad. There were some historians who said that back in the day. Every historian I know today would disagree with that. So our understanding of history changes. But here's the thing, right? A lot of people would say these people weren't victims. Slavery was not that bad. The master took care of them. They were fed. They were clothed. Of course, this is misguided. It is an attempt really to gloss over the dark side, in a sense. Some say it wasn't all that bad. Some say, well, it wasn't so long ago. It was so long ago that you should just get over it. But of course, its effects are with us today. Some people say, well, it wasn't that bad. It was so long ago, or they might say, slavery existed throughout the world. For all of human history, it existed. So it was just part of human experience. Why are you picking on the United States? Well, people who say that don't consider the differences between Atlantic slavery and those systems of slavery that existed in the old world. We're going to talk about this. And of course, it's not just the United States, but it was Europeans who engaged in the brutal Atlantic slave trade in the Americas. It wasn't just the United States, but this Atlantic slave trade was the worst form of slavery in human history. And we're going to talk about that. Some people will say, well, they're not victims because slavery was all these things, right? Or they might say that any problems within the Black community today are their own fault. They will argue, this is the land of opportunity. We ended discrimination. So your poverty, your crime, these are all personal faults of your own. But of course, this lacks context. All of this ignores the atmosphere of intolerance and degradation that existed, that surrounded all of these matters. When people talk like this, they ignore that wealth and status and culture, all of that is heritable. So you can, meaning you can give it to your children will inherit it. But if you don't have wealth, if you don't have status, if you don't have a culture of success, it's going to be very difficult to give that to your children. So a lot of this lacks context, and a lot of this lacks, of course, more nuance. What we should understand is, though, that Black history is, in fact, American history. Studying Black history, I mean, we have to understand, and I'm just going to kind of go over some things here, right? Black people have been defenders of the nation. From the very beginning, Black men fought in the wars. They fought in the American Revolution against the British and in every war since then. The Black culture has been a fountain of our national culture. You can see it in our music, in our dance, in our dress, in our language, the way we talk. Black vernacular is mainstream today, even if we don't even know it. People say 24/7 all the time, but that started in the Black community back in the 80s sometime, or maybe even earlier. And we could probably point to a whole bunch of words that have gone mainstream. How many times you see somebody talk about, baby mama or baby daddy, things. They even made a movie about it, right? The point is, Black culture is infused in the U.S. culture, what people call American, quote unquote. So fountains of culture, defenders of the nation, builders of wealth, right? In fact, slavery was very, very profitable. It made a lot of money for this country, and both North and South made money from it. So builders of wealth, workers in the Industrial Revolution, workers who were often used to lower wages when white workers were going on strike, and a lot of times they would hire companies would hire black workers to come in and take their place. Of course, there's a divide and conquer thing going on, but my point here is simply this: is that there's a contribution. Also, today, the majority of service workers, or let me put it this way: there is a large overlap between service workers and people in the Black community. But they've also been fighters for freedom and equality, not just for themselves, but for others, right? Black freedoms are human freedoms. But we should also understand something, is that it hasn't always only been their fight. Many white people, at every instance that we can look through in history, many white people abhorred, hated what they saw. When it comes to slavery, when it came to segregation, when it comes to hatred, throughout the centuries, white people, there was always white folk who stood up, called for change, and were punished. Now, I should stop and say, all subcultures, all communities can say the same thing. All communities can talk about how they are defenders of the nation, fountains of culture, builders of wealth, fighters for freedom and equality, right? We can say this about women, Mexican Americans, poor whites in labor struggles, Asians, all kinds of people have contributed to the nation's success. Those are all part of American history as well. Of course, here we're talking about African American history. Because of all this push in the recent decades, by now we have some high schools and many college textbooks that are more inclusive, that recognize a lot of this history. A lot of educators, especially college professors, are engaging this history. They're teaching it, they're researching it, emphasizing, of course, the Black experience and what it means within this nation. And a lot of people are calling for a more nuanced history. And by doing that, we highlight connections. We highlight connections. We can look at the past and look at how the connections between people who lived long ago, they had more complex relationships than we currently understand. When you look back a couple centuries ago, a lot of my students are really surprised to hear that in the English colonies in the early years, interracial marriage was a thing. You had Black people marrying white people, and it was not a huge thing. So by looking at this history, we can kind of reevaluate the relationship between people back in the day. And it helps us think about how there are connections between the people of the past and us, the people who live in this country today. Studying this history will allow us to see how we are similar, different, but all really part of the same thing. This is a photo of a Norman Rockwell painting, one of my favorites. Norman Rockwell was a celebrated sort of Americanist, right? And he painted a lot. You're probably familiar with him, right? He painted a lot of pictures of Americana, these sorts of I guess I'm not an art person, so it's difficult for me to find words, but these everyday sorts of scenes that, in a sense, only happened in the United States, right, at the time. And I think this is one of them. I mean, melting pots, tossed salad, however you want to see it, this is us. So the study of history will enlighten us in the various ways that we talked about, for sure. We have to admit something, and that is it's going to raise a lot of issues. It raises issues. Who are we? Who are we as a country? Who are we as a nation of people? Are we a nation, or are we a nation of various nations? Meaning, when we think of nation, what we should think of is people, communities. So Malcolm X, for example, said black people are a nation among themselves because they are separated out. And they live amongst themselves. And so, in a sense, they are a nation living within another nation. And so, are we a nation of nations? And I'm not just talking black, white, but what of culture? Are we a nation today? I mean, look at the political divides. Are we two separate nations here? So we can analogize, right, from the study of history, the study of this African American history. It helps us to analogize to the how we see other sorts of relationships. So, we have to remember we are heirs of this history. We have inherited what came before, whether we like it or not. The past informs who we are, and in large part, what we will be. But of course, we make choices, but we can only make choices as to we will be by being able to look at and see who we were and think about who we are. And think about this question. What does it mean to be, quote, an American? Is it easily defined? Are we not all Americans? Some people would say that some people fit this American term and others do not. I'll tell you, I mean, this happens around the world, but of course, even here, when people see someone like me and say, well, where are you from? Right. And, I tell them, but there are people who look like me, whose families have been here for centuries. And like, what do you mean where am I from? I'm from here. Of course, I don't get offended by that because I know that people will, you know, I know people are curious and they don't mean anything by it, right? When they say, where are you from? But it brings up this question. What does it mean to be a quote unquote American? Not everybody thinks of people who look like me. I'll give you an example, and not just in the United States, but in Japan. When I was in Japan, I actually so a lot of people who were in the program with me in the JET program, the exchange and teaching program, they were teaching at high schools or K through 12, whatever. But on the side, they would do tutoring to make some extra money, and it was good money, good money. Japanese were always willing to pay money for English lessons. And I put up. I mean, my friend said, "Hey, put up a sign, right? All you gotta do is go over here to the International Center, put up a sign, and somebody will call you. You can teach them English for, however many dollars an hour, yen an hour. Yen is the Japanese currency, of course. Well, I would meet people. They would take a look at me, and they would never hire me. And it was really, I understood later or I understood very quickly, that it's because they actually didn't think I could speak English. Their view of quote unquote what an American was not me. Now, of course, that's Japan, but you still see people like this in this country who see that, who will have this particular view of what that means. So studying this history will raise these questions. What does it mean to be an American, right? Who are we as a country? Are we committed to our values? We're a country that is built, we say, on freedom and equality, but how can a nation founded on these notions of freedom and equality have enslaved brothers and sisters? How can they have done this, wrongfully incarcerated men once slavery was over, segregated communities for so long, segregated them with the intent to keep them from the very best that this country has to offer? Now, these are not easy questions to face. They're not easy answers. There are no easy answers here. But the study of African American history gives us reason to hope that we will gain some understanding, that we will maybe align our nation's values with our founding principles of greater inclusion and equality. But studying African American history also does something else. It gives us a place to celebrate. What do I mean by this? Well, we don't do what we used to. Now, I think there are some people in this country who would gladly return to the quote unquote good old days, segregation, maybe even slavery, lynching, biological arguments on racial superiority. There are people in this country who believe this, but most people in this country, and I hope all of you, would reject these. We don't do what we used to do. We have come from somewhere. We're still moving, of course. The question is, which direction? Now, there are some observers of society and culture today who say that we're somewhere else now and we're at a turning point. We seem fractured. Which way are we going to go? I don't know. I'm doing my part here by teaching this class, and CCV is doing its part. You're doing your part by signing up for it. And, ironically, many people would say that teaching this history actually contributes to the divisions that we talked about, because it highlights our failures and our divisions. I would say this country is an idea. And it's an idea that must be tested. If it's worth anything at all, then we must test our dedication to it. Studying African American history is crucial to that. I'm going to leave you with a question. As we proceed through this history, I want you to ask yourself continually just ask yourself something about Black Lives Matter. Now, I don't mean this to be political. I don't mean it to condone or disparage the movement, but I do think there's an interesting question embedded in this movement and in the title of the movement. As we move through, when we begin, ask yourself, do Black Lives matter at this point? At what point in our history have we as a nation said that Black Lives matter? I think, for example, when we start, we'll talk about slavery. At that point, and as you move through, ask yourself that question. And of course, with that question comes, what is an American? What are these people American? If Black Lives Matter, they must be. But at what point did that happen? Now, very often when I say Americans, American, I will do air quotes, because for me, America is the Western Hemisphere. I'll usually say United States, U.S. or the U.S. But at what point have we decided that in the United States, Black Lives Matter? Give you a final note, really quickly, sort of off topic, but I just kind of want to throw this out there. The video lectures I'm going to put up, right? It's interesting. The word lecture, by the way, some of you may know, it comes from the word read or reading. It used to be, because books used to be very, very hard to come by back in the day, that a lecture involved one guy reading it to himself and understanding it, and then standing up and rereading it to everybody else. So you'd have one guy reading it to everybody. That's what a lecture was. Now, I'm not doing that. I'm not just reading out of a book, but I am giving you stuff that I've put together out of various sources and put them into these lectures for you. They will be the center of your learning. They will be raw, but it will give you the information that you need to succeed. If something doesn't make sense, if there's something that you're not quite getting in the lectures, let me know. And because these lectures are raw, I might post one and then think, oh, I missed something or I misspoke, and then I might just follow up with an announcement to kind of fill in that gap. As I said, this is new for a lot of us. I've never taught on Canvas before. I've never taught at CCV before. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully you gotten to the end of this, and hopefully I have helped you understand sort of how I see things. I really hope that you have a good experience. Yeah, well, good, right? What does that mean? I really hope that you come away with a greater understanding of who we are, okay, and who we want to be. So I will leave it there. Thank you all for listening. This is Professor TOVANCHE signing off. I will be posting this, I think, in an announcement email. All right. Thank you and take care.